Boulder. Chance of thunder showers possible overnight with high temperatures in the 80s again tomorrow. Coming up at 6 o'clock, an hour of international news from the BBC, and then at 7, the latest in hip-hop music with Eclipse. That's all still ahead this evening on KGNU Boulder.
Tim and Molly O'Brien make a rare appearance at the 7th
And again, you can pick up tickets during business hours here at KGNU Boulder. Our studios are at 1900 Folsom, the corner of Folsom and Walnut. Stay tuned next for Antithesis here on Boulder County Community Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome to Antithesis.
Antithesis is a weekly radio soiree of stimulating commentary and entertaining conversation discussing issues of importance in our daily lives.
Antithesis airs Sunday afternoon at 5:30.
I'm Richard Curtis.
I'm Leo Griep-Ruiz.
The opinions expressed on Antithesis are the opinions of the person speaking them,
and do not necessarily represent the views of the board, staff, or management of KGNU or of us here at Antithesis.
Because I might not agree with him.
And I might not agree with him.
The debt is owed, but by whom? So, there's this guy running around the country, or running around Georgetown University at least, suggesting that white Americans owe a back debt to black Americans for unfair financial gains made as a result of slavery. This debt, according to business professor Richard America, and that is his real name, is between 5 and 10 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. Professor America bases his numbers on the gross income of white people. And this got me to thinking, I agree that African Americans are owed a very large debt by people who profited from slavery. And I'm not in a position to put a dollar figure on that debt, but I'm happy to use Professor America's numbers. However, it strikes me that this debt is owed by the people who profited from slavery, not from everyone who simply happens to be white. The distinction here may seem fine, but it's actually very significant. You see, the issue needs to be understood in terms of power and responsibility, in terms of class interests, which Professor America is probably not allowed to acknowledge as he works for a business school. Anyway, my point is that there is something obscene about suggesting that the rest of us are liable for a debt incurred by the people who owned slaves and therefore profited from the slaves' unpaid labor. Just because someone happened to be white does not mean that they profited from slavery. In fact, the opposite is more likely true. When the price of a commodity is low in one place, the net effect is for prices everywhere to drop so as to stay competitive. Our labor exists in a market. That is, the price of labor is determined by market forces. This was also true, even if it was on a smaller scale, 150 years ago. So, if some labor costs only as much as a slaveholder spends to keep slaves alive, then the wages other laborers can demand from owners is lower. This is true because wage workers were in competition with slaves. We don't like to think about our labor, our time, creativity, and energy as existing in a market, but it does. We are all degraded by being forced to live with this arrangement, but let us not avoid the reality simply because it is insulting to our humanity. The reality is that slave labor, like child labor and prison labor, is cheap. When employers are allowed to make use of cheap labor, they increase their profits by driving down wages for everyone else. In the case of the U.S., slave labor was used in all kinds of fields, from skilled to unskilled, depending on the situation. Thus, the net effect was to keep wages lower for non-slave workers. Karl Marx once commented that as long as labor in the black skin is enslaved, labor in the white skin will never be free. Now that labor in the black skin is not enslaved, but still underpaid and super-exploited, we have won half the battle. Race is used to keep working people divided. Some white people think that they somehow benefit personally from the fact that racially oppressed people make less money than they do. Fools. The reality is that white people live in the same market for labor as racially oppressed people, even internationally now. When wages are kept artificially low for large segments of the working class because of our history of racism, then wages for the rest of us are inevitably lower. White people are not in a position of privilege by virtue of the fact that they are white and therefore paid, on average, slightly more than other workers. White people's wages are kept down by the same system of racial oppression that keeps non-whites' wages even lower still. Therefore, Professor America's suggestion that white people as a group owe a debt to the descendants of slaves is absurd and terribly misguided. This is so not because the descendants of slaves are not owed a debt, both financial and moral. They are. But rather because this debt is owed by the descendants of the people who actually owned and profited from slavery. Most white people were themselves oppressed by the system of slavery in the form of lower wages, and are thus owed a debt as well. It is the owning class which owes African American people in particular, and all working people in general, a great debt for the exploitation, suffering, injury, and death which we as a class have suffered for hundreds of years. The fact that this debt is greater to the descendants of slaves should not be glossed over, but neither should we ignore the reality of the increased exploitation of all working people which slavery enabled and racism today perpetuates. This is Richard Curtis.
Boy, that sure is Richard Curtis, and so are you.
So, Richard Curtis, you're live in the studio.
Yeah. Well, live by way of tape. Should we let them in on the little secret that we don't really come in here every Sunday afternoon? Otherwise, we wouldn't have any adventures to talk about. You know what I mean? And
no, we can't let them in on that secret.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's tape. I mean, did you know that it's against FCC? At least it used to be before the Republicans took everything over. I don't know what it's like now. But, Democrats got it back, but they didn't change it back. It's still bad shape, man. Radio and all that. Community radio, public radio, whatever public radio is nowadays. It's not very public. Anyway, yeah.
Huh?
So, well, I think that the answer out of your dilemma there, Richard, is to obviously pay the debt to everybody and give everybody their fair share of it and get it over with. You know, the problem is that we're going to have to go after these things piecemeal, even though I'm, like going to walk someplace, I can only put my foot on one piece of ground at a time.
Okay. How many of you understood that?
You can only take one little piece of it. You can only eat your cake one bite at a time. Well, I suppose you could be like a stone glutton,
John Belushi style.
Well,
see what it did for him.
Yeah, I know. God.
Yeah, you don't do
Jerk.
that then. Don't do that.
Don't OD. If you're listening, it's not cool to OD.
I was just thinking about stuffing cake in your mouth.
Well, he OD'd too. That was symbolic of the other kinds
of lifestyle.
Gluttony, yeah. I mean, he was so cool and went out so quick, jerk. So anyway, pay the debt to everybody. Just pay it all off. Yeah, like U.S. out of North America like that. Take all of the assets that are left over, add it up, and divide it up. Period. Easy. Cool. Quick. Clean and easy. But it's like, yeah, but it's not going to happen that way. It's not going to happen clean and easy, and it's not going to happen all at once. It's going to happen piecemeal. I was talking to one cat that really took umbrage at some of the statements I was making, but then I wanted him to because I thought he was being sort of a pain. But he did make sense about one thing that he said, where I asked him, what happens to empires? Inevitably, and he says, well, they all collapse. And I go, what happened? Yeah, how does that? He says, well, they all generally break down into smaller, republics, nations, countries, nation-states. And I don't know what it's going to look like in the future, man. But something's got to, something's going down. And the point is, what kind of shape are we going to give it? What are we doing to actually put it in some kind of shape? Sitting around paying $300 for 2 days of listening to some of the world's smartest people, and then go around acting like you're smart because you happen to have $300 to go listen to what are supposed to be a bunch of smart people, are actually, getting your hands dirty, going out there and really living with the people and finding out what it is.
Actually doing something.
Actually really doing something to affect business as usual, besides just making smart choices at the local, or pseudo-organic, veggie mongering local corporate.
Whatever. Where are you going
market.
with that?
Well,
I don't know. Actually, I thought I might get a little bit of a rise out of you with this particular piece, because I thought you might want to object to some of the ways that I portray this.
Oh, I thought that some of the ways you portrayed it were exactly how I expected you to portray it, and that was kind of cool. I mean, that's the whole, last time we really solidly agreed on something, we gave out the wrong phone number, right?
And you made me agree.
We gave out the wrong phone number. Well, you agreed with me. I mean, I thought, well, let me see this guy. It's 447-9911. If people need to call up the comment line, please call the comment line. I don't know who you were calling.
Yes, but this time please call the comment line.
Please call the comment line, 447-9911. If somebody out there was getting a lot of calls for us, call us up and comment. I haven't had the guts to call up the number we were giving out to find out who's on the receiving end of it.
Okay. You know, I actually sent copies of this particular piece to William Raspberry, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, syndicated. Raspberry's the guy I found out about America from. So I got his address and I got America's address, and I sent them both this piece. And that was 3 weeks ago now.
And they haven't responded. Did you give them your email address and all that stuff?
Haven't heard from them. Gave them my email address and everything.
Huh. Well, I think that,
neither of them actually has email. I had to do some research to find that out.
This is the reason that I thought it was so important to just start out by saying, obviously, the answer is to pay the debt to everybody that's owed money by this, stinking pile of exploitation and murder. They say that, the Aztec temples in Tenochtitlan reeked of the odor of human blood, man. There's a stench over D.C., say nothing over Wall Street and, all the life insurance companies in Omaha and all the phone banks in North Carolina, wherever the hell they are, all that stuff. There's a serious stench, yeah.
Stench.
They say that President Bush, that his chair in the White House was elevated by a stack of something like at least 50,000 bodies, if not more, that he was responsible for through his various decisions, And certainly the sacrifice continues to be practiced, as you alluded to. I've often said that whenever, like General Motors or something like that, builds a car, or let me say them all, Ford, Lincoln Ford, and then who's the other one, Chrysler, all of them, all the big three, or anybody, makes any kind of market decision, and they know that a certain number of people are going to die, they just don't know who, then they are obviously engaged in a conspiracy to commit premeditated random murder, and there's something wrong with that. But the state is obviously incapable and lacking the political will and all of that stuff to deal with it. So to me, those are human sacrifices for the great god of green, man, of money. The wrong green, paper green, green money, frog skins, all that stuff.
No, actually, that's true. Lee Iacocca actually found himself in court as a result of the Pintos blowing up, because he was the vice president at Ford that okayed that. He made that decision. He said, okay,
as far as I'm concerned, it's just killing.
They fined him $1.
Well, that's what anybody else's life is worth besides his. To him, in the general scheme of things, though I think that there's an argument to be made that, we can still see demographically that certain sector of the society, basically European Americans, generally earn more money than just about everybody else. There's a couple of other ethnic groups that, are kind of up there on the scale, but they have such wide disparities that the median income figures are,
Anyway, a while back I was interviewing Vic Parlow, who's the author of a new book out, The Economics of Racism 2, his second update of that. It's actually that's available from imported publications out of New York. And he puts the figure on, the annual figure on the surplus profit earned by American corporations from the lower wages that they pay racially oppressed people at $200 billion a year.
Yeah, that's about right.
$200 billion a year. He estimates that racially oppressed people actually lose $400 billion a year as a result of unemployment and those lower wages. I asked him about about this particular issue, and he said it obviously is difficult to gauge, but guessed that the losses white workers incur as a result of this system of super exploitation was about equal, $200 billion a year. Now that's spread over more people, since there are more white workers than workers of color, but it's an important point that everyone's losing out. Everyone who works is losing out, so that a few rich people make a lot of extra money.
Well, everybody's losing out, yet at the same time, I think it's important to just look and say which groups got the bucks. If we happen to use this ridiculous, arcane, and ultimately accept sociologically meaningless concept of human ethnicity or color. I refuse to use race because there's only one race. It's got a bunch of colors. Human race, right?
Human race. All right, we'll do that.
But still, there's a certain sector which has got consistently greater median resources, or access to a greater median level of resources. And if we look at this one characteristic that tends to be present with a certain high statistical probability, it's lighter European, generally Northern Western European ancestry, color stuff,
Right.
you know. And given that fact, I think that would indicate that there has been a certain uneven enjoyment of what are ultimately the world's resources, and that something should be done about that. And everybody's not always going to live at exactly the same level, but even my real conservative father, who voted Republican on into the last years of his life, I am certain, one time told me the only way to get justice on the world was to take all the wealth and divide it back up again. Well, obviously that's true, and obviously that's not going to happen.
This guy voted for Republicans?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Or at least he claimed to.
Well, he was just teasing you.
I don't know. Anyway, it's got to start somewhere, and how it starts is always going to look nasty. It always looks bad, man. If I got 6 horses and you got 1, and 5 of my 6 horses belong to your father, and my father stole them from you, and I had to give you some of them horses back, I'd wind up with less horses, and I probably really like my horses a lot, but I'd have to give them up to you, and it's not fun. It's hard. So I think people ought to, start dividing it up and throwing one big party. Playing. Well, there again, we have cultural problems. We'd like to have loud music. And I was at a party, man, like all nice people, and there was no music, and I was like, gee, what's,
You were at a party with no music?
and no chili on the table. With people making...
What were these people thinking?
Well, they make the crew that was there probably earns anywhere between $100 and $300 a year.
So they're not thinking.
I don't know. Well, they think a lot. Their business causes them to be professional thinkers. Their minds are bought for fees, ranging up into $200-$400. Huge fees an hour. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But not thinking about important things.
Lawyers, big time lawyers. That's when I put on an entirely different.
When you're at a party, there's no music. Somebody's not thinking. That's all I'm saying.
If I'm at a party, man, and there's no... Well, actually,
that's all I'm saying.
That's a typical Chicano view. I'm glad, we have a lot in common.
Well, it's my view, too.
Oh, good. Yeah, got to have music.
I could be honorary Chicano for a while.
Well, you can do just... That's the whole deal, man. You came to Colorado, so get with the program, Jack. Come on.
I was brought to Colorado.
Yeah, plus you're here. So let's just get it on. That's the whole point. Is let's just have a party. Let's just turn up the music. Let's just play music and listen to it and like that. But unfortunately, sometimes the chainsaws are going so loud you can't hear the music. So then you got to go shut down the chainsaw.
That's rude.
Though I think that the Civil War was generally very much misperceived because of all the propaganda that was about slavery. When slavery was like the big PR issue, but really there was something a little bit deeper, like the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a big deal and certainly an act of war by any stretch of the imagination. Yet nobody ever talks about how the war was really fought because of all of what had been done to keep Japan from getting to oil when it was becoming, growing industrialized. They didn't want to do it, but Perry sailed the black ships in and forced them to open up, right? So they did, and here they were at a point of being asked to compete on the global market. They had no damn access to oil, so they went for it in kind of a, jerky way at the level of national policymakers. But then when national policymakers get their back up against the wall, they do kind of get like jerks. In fact, they're jerks most of the time, at least around here they've been.
Well, Japanese have been doing that too for a while.
Yeah, I'm not,
wasn't new in 1840.
No, the government's been pretty, interesting. So back to the whole point of this thing is that the war of what's called the Civil War was fought largely because the South thought it had the right to split because it wanted to sell its raw materials that it produced, primarily cotton, to somebody who would pay a better price than the industrial North, and that somebody else was basically England and France and other European countries, especially England, that had a huge textile industry. But the North is saying, no, man, we want that stuff because they got this historic thing going on, with England that they haven't been that friendly about, and that was the heart of the Revolutionary War to begin with, was up in that Yankee country, right? So here they were saying, no, man, we're going to put these huge export duties on this stuff. So when you pay them export duties, the price you're going to have to charge is so much that the English and the French won't want it. It won't be worth their while because they can get it from other places by ship for what you'll sell it to them for. So you got to keep selling it to us, and we will keep getting a good low price for it because the only thing that makes the price high is the export duty. So we're the only market left.
Clever.
You had a buyer's market, and that was why the South wanted to secede. Now there's a whole deal with the slaves, which sucks. But Lincoln Lincoln wanted to emancipate Africans in America back to Africa, which, in the long run might, certainly have. Let's look at what's up, with so-called racial. The fact that they're going to have a discussion, a dialogue on race, well after the bicentennial, they still haven't figured it out after 200 years. Give me a break. It's like they haven't figured out education for Chicanos after almost 150 years. Now, we're going to throw a party. Next February, man, February of 1999 is the 150th year of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Chicanados going to throw some big-time pachanga over that one. Shall we start talking about some reparations deals?
No.
No, it's not. The government won't give them.
I think reparations is the wrong angle.
Well, I don't care what the angle is. We'll just take it back. They're not going to give it, so we're just going to have to,
right. Well, that's true. But when you talk, that's the thing. When you talk about money, it sounds like you can, you can like write a check
can pay
and
the bills.
it'll be okay.
Well, there's times when money don't pay no bills.
Right. The issue is power.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the point that was raised by Shirley Otero a few weeks ago at the International Indigenous Peoples Tribunal. She said that the reason that every kind of repression has been thrown against the people in the San Luis Valley is because the government sees that with power or with land is power, and that the people there are growing, and the people got land and will have access to more land, and they will have power. And they don't want the people to have that power. They want to keep them busy. They want to create the kind of circumstances that will cause people to subdivide their holdings and lose little pieces and little pieces and little pieces of it until it looks like the road between Denver and Boulder, which someday is not going to have one single place where you can look and not see a bunch of houses. Forgetting how really important it is to the human psyche to be able to look every once in a while and look out and see unbroken country. Trees and mountains and stuff help lower the scale of that unbroken country, but still it looks unbroken, and you need that, man. There's a vast difference between land which is, anonymously owned and land which is unknown. You can have that unknown sense even if you know who the owner is. Remember when Hogg had all his weird signs out there south of Denver?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
South of Denver on that first big uphill rise, there's kind of a ridge. It runs east off the Rockies there.
Yeah.
And around Larkspur, that roughly around that area somewhere. And as you go up toward that, into that ridge, into that east-west ridge, there used to be a place where this guy had all this old farm equipment, and he was going off on President Johnson.
Fortunately, I don't remember
they
that.
They had banned billboards. You couldn't put up no billboards. And he used to make money with his billboards, and the highway divided his farm, so it wasn't like cost effective. He couldn't get back and forth across his fields anymore because of the long stretch of highway. And they wouldn't let him put up billboards to make back the money that he lost because of the highway going through his land. And he had all these old rusted farm implement stuff. He wouldn't sell it off. He just let it rust and go away. And he had all these homemade billboards out there that said all this like really cool, folksy, insulting stuff, And
cool, folksy, insulting stuff.
Yeah. Like, and his name was Hogg, H-O-G-G, Mr. Hogg. And that was what, you knew who owned it? Mr. Hogg owned the land, but it was so idiosyncratically weird with all of his signs up and stuff like that it was still unknown, even if it was, cultivated land to a large extent. And even that's being lost between Denver and Boulder, man. Human psyche needs some space. People got some space up in the mountains, and I'm talking about an entirely different subject. I'm sorry, Richard. We want to talk about slavery, but you're just smiling.
Where are you going? Sometimes I just watch. Leo just goes, and you really never know where it's going to end.
The question is,
sometimes it's a really weird ride.
Who would raise the cotton?
So we just go on the road.
So my question is, who would raise the cotton, man? Obviously the cotton became impossible for Hogg to raise. It was slaves that raised the cotton. If there were no slaves, would the South have raised cotton?
Wait, does that mean we're going back to the
If
Civil
there
War again?
was, yes, exactly. That's where Hogg took
Well,
us.
no,
He
that's why
couldn't grow stuff no more. People can't afford the labor. They don't grow it no more, right? Now, supposing there had been no slaves, supposing there had been no demonic triangular slave trade, supposing 1/10 the number of Africans who were taken to South America, Brazil in particular, were not brought to what is now the United States. You realize that's only 10% of the entire slave trade? Or actually less than that, around 9% or something, because 10 times more went to Brazil in particular, Latin America in general. Anyway, suppose those Africans had not been brought here. Suppose there had been no slaves. Suppose there had been nobody to work under those terms. Suppose there had been nobody who could have been driven into such abject subjugation that they would not even attempt educating themselves without knowing that they were putting their lives at risk, who were working on those fields, raising that cotton, tobacco, whatever else worked in the slave, areas. Would that stuff have been raised? What would the economy have looked like? Is there any way to tell? Would it have been Appalachia between, Washington, D.C. and Tulsa?
No, cotton would just cost more.
Or, but would they have even grown the stuff if they didn't have the ability to do it in that way? Because they had the labor, because they had the actual physical labor. There's the question. If you're dealing with enough of a population base that you can say that if these workers are gone, some more workers will come in. But at that time, there was not a population base. There was a spreading population that focused in New England and then went out to certain other centers and created places then like Chicago, like Cleveland, like Springfield, like Dayton, those sorts of places. But what if those population centers had instead been created in other patterns? They might have moved more to the south than they would have to the west had there not been slavery taking up huge plots of land. There might have been an entirely different kind of development in the south, and we have absolutely no idea what it is. Because I think that slavery and the cotton gin, slavery and the cotton gin combined, Eli Whitney combined, created King Cotton in the South.
Right.
And it's not just the fact that these are field hands and laborers. There's also, I think, the fact that there was so much in the way of psychological repression that there was no other option than being field hands and laborers. Yet there were these other people that were creating we see different patterns of settlement where we have very few European Americans by themselves. We see the sort of settlement patterns of Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, places like that, which is different from how the South developed. And if you look at a map of the South, you will see these little teeny tiny towns like just thoroughly densely populating the region, and things would have just been different.
And your point would be?
That I don't think that you can say that white people being able to take over for slaves and raising cotton would have led to basically the same kind of conditions as black folks got now, because at the time the patterns of migration and settlement and the ways in which people made livelihoods and the methods, the processes of what I guess is called the primitive accumulation of capital, leads to very different circumstances from what you have once that capital is in place and it's already functioning and motivating. And now, certainly people migrating from the South to Detroit to work in the auto industry is a commonplace, so people could easily migrate from somewhere else and all wind up in Texas and watch the oil puddles go dry. And you have this big population that'll work for basically nothing. But there was a time when you didn't have the same kind of mobility, and there were just, like I say, vastly different settlement patterns, so I don't think we can say that it's really true that white labor and African-American labor or any other form of labor could have been interchangeable at the time that capitalism was accumulating, was actually being created in the South based on this huge labor pool, which may not have been that cheap, because keeping a slave healthy and keeping a farmer, a worker starved in the alley and looking for a hit of crack, because that's better than real life,
About the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is probably the point that you were trying to make in some twisted way. But what the heck? Don't forget to give us
And you finally got there. You found it on your own.
Well,
I let you go, and you found it.
Well, because like I said, the way to deal with it from the very beginning, I said, is give everybody what they're owed. The only way that's going to happen is by erasing them stars off that blood-streaked banner, folks. So
I don't
get
care
to
about
work.
the stars. I think
Well, you know, that's
those
symbolic.
property
We're
deeds
poetic,
you were talking
man.
about last week.
Yeah, we're poetic.
Oh,
You know,
poetic.
we're poetic people.
But we're at the end of the show again.
And just keep on erasing them stars, folks, and knocking over them dominoes. History demands it of you. And your children will be that much happier because you did. Thank you.
You've been listening to Antithesis, 5:30 to 6, weekly on Sundays on KGNU Boulder.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's KGNU
Hello.
Boulder. The comment line is 477-9911, not the other bunk number we were giving out before.
447.
Oh, 447-9911. You're right. I tried another bunk number, tried to slide it by him, but he disagreed with me, saving you from calling somebody by mistake.
Thanks for listening.
Call us on the email, too.